Welcome, everyone. This is Mark Ahlstrom. I'm president of the ESIG Board of Directors and VP of Renewable Energy Policy for NextEra Energy Resources. I want to welcome you to the 2021 Spring Technical Workshop. Energy Systems Integration Group is an international nonprofit educational organization that serves critical roles for those of us working in the industry. For those of us working on the technical and transformative aspects of power systems, both in North America and around the world. Dozens of us volunteer our time to the organization, whether through serving on the board of directors or advisory council, chairing and participating in working groups and task forces, moderating and participating in panels and webinars, writing blogs, and many other activities. We do this because we have found the organization to be indispensable when it comes to learning, sharing, and collaborating on the technical issues that are critical for all of us as individuals, for our organizations, and for society. All ESIG workshops have been online events during the pandemic, which is a big change from our wonderful face-to-face workshops. And a number of you have asked me, how is ESIG doing during this year? While we were very concerned at first, our member organizations stuck with us, new members have joined, and growth in foundation funding for the ESIG mission has been very strong. In fact, we have roughly doubled ESIG's funding, staffing, task forces, and participation over this past year. For full-time ESIG staff, in addition to Executive Director Charlie Smith, we now have added Debbie Liu as Associate Director and Ryan Willis as Director of Marketing and Operations. In addition, Professor Mark O'Malley is on full-time assignment with ESIG to lead ESIG's key role as a core team member of the Global Power System Transformation Consortium, a major worldwide effort to support power system operators with advanced solutions required for the global energy transition. I don't have time to tell you here about all of the amazing details, including major new task force projects on rethinking resource adequacy, macro grid transmission, grid forming inverters, open system participation of distributed resources, system flexibility, and hybrid resources. Nor do I have time to discuss our ongoing progress in dramatically increasing the training, materials, and briefing documents for decision makers that come from what we collaboratively create together here at ESIG. But I urge members to attend the ESIG annual membership meeting on March 29th, where I will provide many more details in my annual President's Report. Today, however, is the first session of the 2021 Spring Technical Workshop, and we'll be holding a series of panels as webinars on Tuesdays and Thursdays from today through April 8th. I hope you are able to join us for all of these panel sessions featuring wonderful speakers. Each session is provided at no charge, and you can register at the events area on the esig.energy website to get the WebEx link for each panel. We hold multiple workshops every year, with this one and the fall technical workshop focusing broadly on the issues like those that will be discussed in the upcoming sessions. But we also hold a forecasting and market design workshop in the summer, operations and maintenance user groups meetings in the spring and fall, and an international energy system integration workshop that rotates among the Americas, Europe, and Asia Pacific locations, not to mention other special topical workshops that we find ourselves organizing or co-sponsoring throughout the year. And every month in between all these workshops, ESIG also provides a rich offering of free webinars, blogs, and other activities. The primary source of support for making all this possible is annual memberships. And I thank you if your organization is a member, and I strongly encourage you to consider joining if you are not currently a member. The modest annual membership fee is based on the budget of your organization. And if your organization has a membership, then everyone in your organization is a member of ESIG. Independent consultants and individuals can also join, and ESIG provides free memberships to students of accredited educational organizations. ESIG is a great place to learn and share your expertise, and we all need to do whatever we can to bring talented people into our industry and help them get working on the important issues. In addition to the major support from the memberships, I'm thankful for the long time and ongoing support from the U.S. Department of Energy, the sustaining membership of NextEra Energy, and I particularly want to thank Analytics, powered by Polaris Systems Optimization, for again being the workshop sponsor for this spring technical workshop. In support of these, the support of these organizations reflects the significance of ESIG for powering system transformation efforts. For each of you individually, I encourage you to add info@esig.energy to your email contact list and be sure you are getting our monthly newsletters. This will keep you informed of all the activities and free events, and we want to make sure that the monthly newsletter is getting through to you. You can also subscribe to the ESIG channel, YouTube channel, and follow ESIG on LinkedIn, Twitter, or Facebook to learn about new webinars, blogs, or activities. And for today, we'll be using the Slido site for Q&A. Ryan Willis will assist me today, and he'll post a Slido link and other social media information in the chat of the session here today. So please submit your questions to Slido and vote on the questions that you want answered that you see there. And we'll be using that for the Q&A that follows the presentation. Now, to kick off our workshop, it's my honor to introduce Dr. Christopher Clack, founder and CEO of Vibrant Clean Energy. Chris is clearly a leader in the modeling and discussion of pathways toward a transformed electric power system design, both here in the US and abroad. In 2012, he created the National Energy with Weather System Simulator, while a principal investigator for a National Academy of Sciences National Research Council project. He later transferred to the Cooperative Institute for Research and Environmental Sciences at the University of Colorado Boulder, where he worked on advancing the way people think about variable generation and its future role. As an expert in mathematics, statistics, and optimization, he combines this expertise with numerical weather prediction, electrical engineering, and economics in his prolific body of work. I'm sure that his analysis of what 100% by 2050 looks like will lead to interesting questions and discussion following his presentation. Chris, the podium is yours.
Hi, thanks, Mark. I apologize if you hear my son running around upstairs. He's just got home and he's excited. But what I'm going to try and do today is go through the slides of some work that we've been working on called 0 by 50. But before I go right into the details of the results, I wanted to highlight a few areas that we're studying to bring to fruition this study and what the implications we think are of modeling the system in the way that we do model it. First of all, just really quickly, VCE, we study these systems for our clients, but we also provide licenses for our models as well as the data we're using. We essentially are trying to help the transition to a clean energy system while thinking about as many components as we can, because we want to be able to embrace the difficulties to work through them rather than just ignoring them and maybe sweeping them under the carpet. So the motivation really for the 0 by 50 study that we're doing, but pretty much everything that we do as a company, is that global emissions keep rising. And if we look at historical data, we're roughly in the mid-Miocene in terms of atmospheric carbon. And that looks like it's around 4 to 5 degrees Celsius higher on average than today. There's a recent paper last year discussing this in detail if you wish to look at it. And 4 to 5 degrees for those that work in Imperial is around 7 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit. And so that's just the equilibrium climate. It doesn't mean it's going to be exactly that, but for me, that kind of boosts me to get on with my work, because I feel like if it's any system that gets into equilibrium, if it can revert back to that, that's a worrying state. And then the second motivation really is that everything that we've done in terms of humanity so far is we've delayed the doubling of CO2 by around four years, which is great. Exponential curves are great for making these sort of wild predictions 30 years out, as we've all experienced in the last year. These curves can change very dramatically, and so we like to track it to see, are we making progress? What progress do we need to make, and how quickly do we need to move? The second motivation is really the amount of energy we need. And so this talk is going to be mainly focused on the US. It's applicable to other regions, but we're using the US as an example here. We have the most knowledge of this region and we've studied it the most. So to give us an idea of how much energy is being used, in 2019, we used 100 quads, essentially, of primary energy. I always translate it to electricity because that's what I know best. And so that's 29.4 petawatt hours, or 29,400 terawatt hours. But of that, nearly 20 petawatt hours is what we call rejected energy, and around 10 is what we actually use as final energy, what we're using for services. So there's two reasons we do this. One is to see where can we get efficiencies, and then how much electricity would we need to provide if we want to electrify the economy or do other things to provide services for the economy. When we think about the whole economy, we only really know really well how to decarbonize electricity. And so the premise behind our study is to really look at how can we electrify as much as we can, and then what do we need to do to electrify through another atom. So you can make hydrogen, you can make ammonia and other products. And so how do these all fit together? And the whole economy will need energy, and it will all need to be clean. Otherwise, we'll still be emitting, and we need to get to zero as quickly as possible. This is a schematic that is part of a science paper that I was involved in back in 2018. And what it's really trying to show is that these things are all interlinked, and we need to be thinking about all of them at the same time, if possible, to try and get some understanding of how they all fit together. So from our modeling, what we have here is the electricity section there is like the traditional wisdom model. And then outside that is all the novel chemicals and fuels, as well as CO2 that we're tracking, modeling, and costing to see how these will integrate back into the electricity system. And so those fuels count for roughly 90% of all the other products we need for energy. There's lots of other products we need for other things, but for energy, these contain most of them. And this was done by one of my colleagues, Brianna. She did a great job on this. And so what we want to be able to do is say, if we're going to produce hydrogen, do we need to store it? Do we need to pipe it around? Do we need to truck it around? And then what is it used for the next tier down, and how does it interact? And we need to link these things together, because some of them flow back into electricity, some of them flow into other products, and we need to understand how they play together. And then finally with CO2, we have this extra piece where we could be capturing it and putting it into what we call deep storage. And that's interesting to kind of model and see how, if we do overshoot for some reason, what will we need to pay to actually reduce the CO2 in the atmosphere. So all these things basically end up coming back to electricity, in our opinion. And what we have is the ability to produce lots and lots of low marginal cost electricity. Wind, solar, geothermal, nuclear, and hydroelectric are the primary ones that we have today. There will no doubt be more in the future. But what we are lacking in the system today is enough flexibility to turn huge amounts of those resources into capacity when we need it. And we call that flexibility resources. It's the bigger chunk here, because there's lots of options. There's lots of different technologies that you can bring together to bear to give us the flexibility. And the more options you have, the less you're going to depend on one of these flexibility resources on their own. And that then alleviates some of the risk factors as we electrify the economy, because by moving it to electricity, we're going to be moving the whole economy onto this electricity grid, essentially, in one way or another. And so reliability becomes a bigger component, because it's not just electricity that might go down, it's all parts of the economy that might go down if there's a grid issue. And so we've got the staples, transmission, storage. Electrification provides some flexibility, demand side management, but then we have some more novel things like producing fuels. That can be flexibility, because you can use it as an anti-generator. We might need new peaking capacity that sits there for a long period of time. Direct air capture could be another flexible resource. And then we have hybrid resources, which are already coming into play quite widely, in the US at least, that will help us shape the generation a bit better. But these need to be combined together somehow to provide lower cost resources. So how much demand do we project? So we have a variety of different demands that we see for electricity. So this is a great chart from NREL's electrification futures study. And they have three categories: reference, mid, and high. Their high gets around 6.5 petawatt hours. Our lowest estimate is around 8 petawatt hours. That's with huge electrification, huge energy efficiencies, but we just see more need for electricity to get to zero emissions. If we add climate impacts in, which I won't get into too much today, it's another area that we're deeply studying. You add around 1 to 2 petawatt hours, so 1,000 to 2,000 terawatt hours of additional demand above what you would see without the climate change impacts. And that's for RCP 4.5. If you did higher or lower, obviously that would change. But we're trying to illustrate that the climate change isn't just going to impact our generation and the risks to our generation. It's going to impact how much we need to do as we move forward in time. And then finally, we have the higher end here, which is where we produce all the products and fuels for synthetically for the rest of the economy. And that raises it again by another 2 petawatt hours. And so, as you can see here, I've kind of drawn them onto the graph, cartoon style, but the lines get much steeper, much quicker, and this is assuming a linear growth. The reason we include the synthetic fuels is we may be spending more energy producing them, but we have a lot more flexibility in the system. We have a lot more delay in the need of providing the electrons exactly when they're needed, because we have the backup storage devices through the synthetic fuels themselves. But also they then allow us to absorb a lot of the excess low-cost generation, wind and solar, when we can't use it for anything else. And rather than wasting it, we can produce these products that will then help us do things like fertilize for food, water treatment, and maybe even remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So what does this look like on the electricity grid? So I'm kind of just taking a 40,000 foot look. So I'm just looking at the whole 48 lower 48 state demand profiles from 2020 and then 2050 estimated. And what we kind of see straight away is the peak today is going to be roughly the minimum of what we're going to see in 2050. And this is the lower estimate. So that means we need a lot more capacity, full stop, right? There's a lot of empty space that we can just fill with clean electrons easily. Just whenever they're generating, that's great, because that's going to fill that space. What we see though also is that in winter, the peak can be much higher than in summer, of the order of 40% higher. The peak is still there in summer and it's difficult to manage, but we now need a new peak in the middle of winter as a nation, as an aggregate. And what that means is we need to think about how we're providing that reliability slightly differently to the way we might think about it today. There's some benefits because the lines might be cooler, things like that for transmission, but we also have problems with icing and other situations too. So just kind of, if you've seen any of our talks before, you'll have seen some of these plots before. This is the capacity factor map for the United States. And we're just trying to show that overall we have really great resources in the US. It's concentrated in certain regions that are generally where the grid is weak. And if you saw the transmission discussion a little while ago, you'll see that this is actually kind of hampering interconnection into these regions, because we're going to swamp certain RTOs with resources, and so they need to be tied to other RTOs ideally as time goes on, which I'll talk about. And the wind and solar are generally dislocated. They're not exactly dislocated, but there's different regions that have better wind resources and solar resources. There is some overlap, of course, but in general, these are different regions that we would need to connect, and then we need to connect them to the load centers as well. And what we find is really useful to do with these data sets is to look at them at high temporal resolution. So we have 5-minute resolution for the last 7 years, and we do it at 3 kilometers. So we're really seeing how these different correlations might build up and how we might be able to use them to reinforce each other. With that in mind, we're building a 175-year data set at the moment for wind and solar. This is still preliminary, but what we are finding is that we do have these very extreme events that are right on the tails. And so on the left we have wind, on the right we have solar. And what we did here is something very, very simple, very basic. We just took each of our grid cells and we put a hypothetical wind and solar farm in every single grid cell across the contiguous US. And then we just summed it up. So obviously the exact resource would change slightly, but what we're seeing is for wind in particular, we're seeing a large spread in the winter seasons, a very narrow spread in the summer seasons, but obviously a lower production number. For the solar, it looks more reliable, but we have some more work to do on the variability of the solar. It's a bit of coarse data because it's 175 years at hourly, and so we're missing some of the variability which we're working on. But the point of having this is we can include this in our model, and we can look at these really extreme events and look at the cost of supplying for it. And that's one of the reasons that brought us to use those synthetic fuel. Even though we're using a lot more final energy, it gives us essentially long duration storage that can ride us through pretty much any long event. Because what we're noticing with the long-term data set is these events are multi-year in general, as well as with wind you get these multi-day events, but these droughts tend to last multiple years. But we've got a lot more work to do on that, but we have to embrace it because we need to be able to solve the issue and think about the variability. So that's kind of just setting up what we're doing. Now I'm going to just show some results from what we've done for this 0x50. And before we start, I just want to make sure everyone understands this is a possible pathway. It's not the pathway. It's not one I'm saying we have to do. We do lots of these pathways. Everyone that studies energy has looked at lots of different pathways. There's always something that you could change that would make things more acceptable for some groups and less acceptable for others, and vice versa. And so what we're trying to do is kind of see what are the core principles that we need from any of the scenarios, and find commonality. So the first thing that we find is everything we do seems to suggest around 65% reduction by 2035 across the economy is quite doable. And by doable, I mean doesn't really raise the cost too much. But this is predicated on not making it zero emissions in the electricity sector by that time. You will add a huge amount of cost to that. But we'll see whether sensitivities around this will make a difference. And then you'd glide down to zero. And this is basically because the modeling keeps showing us that the holistic view of the whole economy makes it cheaper over time, because you can, if things get hard for 1 or 2 years, because there's a constraint somewhere, you can flip, or the model can flip to something else, and it gives us more choices to pick from along the curve. Also, we do reduce the criteria pollution as well, of course, over time. And these are kind of working with the pollution of GHGs. The only one that kind of does something a bit more different is CH4, which methane emissions. And that's really because very early on it uses a bit more natural gas, and then it tapers down, and so we get some upstream emissions as well. So what does this look like in terms of capacity for the US? So we see a roughly doubling to tripling of the installed capacity in the US in terms of generation. We have to retire all coal by 2035 at the latest. We don't need to build any new natural gas if we're careful and we plan, but we do need to build storage pretty quickly as well. And then we do need to keep GTs or hydrogen turbines, if they exist, for emergencies at the end, as well as some CCS with natural gas. And that's all synthetic, the natural gas with CCS. And that's again there to give us some base load, not base load, but flexibility in the load to ride through. And then we have advanced nuclear coming in as well, that really seems to help depress the pricing and give additional flexibility. But if you look at 2035, from all the studies I've seen, it's pretty close to what everyone else suggests. We double the amount of capacity on the grid, and we don't build any gas. Maybe some people build a little bit of gas, but put storage, lots of wind and solar. We have a little bit of advanced nuclear, but we could keep our legacy nuclear alive, and that would pretty much do the same thing, and retire coal. So it's 2035, we see lots of commonality. After that, things do change quite a bit, depending on which pathway you go down. And in this, we're using the NREL ATB 2020 low projections for the cost of technologies, except for the novel technologies, which we've used our own research for. And then finally, the annual cost of this system by 2050, including producing some synthetic fuel and other components, is around $400 billion in real dollars, real 2018 dollars by 2050. I want to show an alternative, just to give you an idea. So again, if you look at 2035, you can see it's roughly consistent with what I just showed. Where it changes is after 2035. Everything else is exactly the same, except I've done 100% variable renewable energy, and we've got an HVDC overlay system. And we end up with 6,000 gigawatts of installed capacity. And all the reliability is really being provided by transmission and storage. And so this comes back to my point that I was trying to make earlier, which is as we reduce our options, we get cornered in terms of there's some disadvantage of one technology or another. And so we end up having to overcompensate on something else, which then drives costs very, very high in our estimates. And so this would be $1 trillion a year to run this system, estimated by the model. And part of the reason for this is we have to build more capacity by 2040 than we do by 2050 in the previous scenario. And so it's really about resource allocation and whether it's appropriate to drive down that. And this, for me, is kind of like, if nothing else shows up, this is what we should do. If there's no other technologies that work, that are deployable, then we're going to have to go down this route. But we're going to have to think about trying to reduce costs in some way compared to the projections that we have. When we look at generation, what we find is not really surprising when we look at what the load was. What we find is wind and solar grow a lot, particularly wind, because there's a lot of energy available. But we see the fossil generation going away in almost a linear fashion after 2020. And then we see this growing wedge of novel technology, particularly advanced nuclear in this case, because it fills the gap of the other thermal generation. It gives us inertia on the grid. It gives it a bit more flexibility. It gives it the ability to provide heat for some of the synthetic fuels, not just the electrons. And it just helps relieve the strain a little bit on the renewables as well. A little caveat with this that I found really interesting when we were studying it was transmission. Different types of technologies for transmission, and then direct air capture can completely change this. And I won't get into it too much today, but direct air capture, if it works, could really provide the flexibility we need of these baseload resources, these flexible thermal resources that would reduce their need quite a bit. And could help with carbon mitigation, but there's a big if on whether that works and what the true costs of it are. If I look at this alternative scenario one more time, just for the generation, we also now see why some of that cost gets so high. We're roughly curtailing 15%, and I want to be as clear as I can that we've given it all the options that the previous scenario got: hydrogen production, ammonia production, synthetic natural gas production, transmission, demand side flexibility. Yet it still thinks it's economic over doing the alternatives to curtail 15%. And I'm sure there's ways to capture that. People are ingenious, but there's just going to be a fundamental mismatch at some level where we're not going to be able to exactly match every 5-minute interval with the demand and the supply. The other thing we notice is that for about 15 years, natural gas flatlines because it really doesn't want to build too much storage to replace it. And so you get a 15-year period where natural gas is pretty much the same throughout the whole period, and then the reduction of natural gas happens towards the end as well. So what does that mean in terms of build out rate? And I've tried to put this in a rate that doesn't, like, all these numbers are mind-bending to me in terms of the scale of them. So for example, by 2035, the model's saying in this scenario where we've got lots of new technologies, particularly nuclear and CCS, we still need to deploy 0.5 terawatt of wind by 2035 and roughly 350 gigawatts of solar by 2035 and 100 gigawatts of storage by 2035 with 7 hours of storage, while simultaneously retiring 400 gigawatts of fossil generation. And then we have to do that basically again by 2050 in the next 15 years as well. But only this time we also need to expand nuclear and storage by quite a bit as well. And so this plot at the bottom is kind of just showing the deployment rate in kilowatts per second. So how many kilowatts we have to deploy per second. I did the net as the numbers there, and then like what we're retiring, what we're adding, because the net kind of hides some of the hard work we're doing. And just to give you an idea, the historical average is around 0.5 kilowatt a second is what we've deployed in the US since the 60s, beg your pardon. So to 2035, it's not too terrible until the last 5 years. But then after 2030, really, we're ramping up pretty significantly what we're deploying. And so this has huge implications on manufacturing materials. And that's another reason why we see growth in demand more than some other models might, because we're trying to model in the demand to build these pieces of equipment to put onto the grid as well. When we look at the system costs, we see a shift, and again, this shouldn't be too surprising to a lot of you in the audience, which is as we go further forward in time, we're shifting more and more of the generation costs to fixed costs from variable costs. What you may not see, but I think makes sense in general, is the distribution costs go up around 50% when we electrify, because we're having to reinforce the distribution grid. But transmission costs aren't going up hugely in this scenario, partly because we have these novel technologies. But even if it did go up, it's still so much smaller than the other components. And then finally, hydrogen is a big new factor that comes in for these scenarios as well. And so I'm not going to get into the whole market design discussion here, but what I will note is that the market designs might have to change slightly for these generators to be compensated in the correct way, because we have a lot of periods where very, very low marginal costs clearing prices are happening, and it's hard to keep them monetized in the model. And what we're showing in this plot at the bottom is the volatility, the monthly volatility of the marginal prices over time. And so at the bottom, we're seeing the quite low volatility in general over the whole US. And that's obviously smoothing out some of the noise that happens on high temporal frequency. But as we add more and more of these renewables and also clean resources that are low marginal cost, the variability starts growing quite a lot. And so in the fall and the winter, we're seeing huge volatilities in the pricing, which is good or bad depending on how you estimate it. But this is assuming the same market structures that we have today. If you extract back and you just say what would be a retail rate to pay for this system, we could lower the retail rate by around 30% nationally, which is important if you want to convince all the other sectors to buy electricity rather than their primary fuel of today. And then finally, the GHG emissions drop from around 410 grams per kilowatt hour down to around 1 gram per kilowatt hour. And that's partly leakage of GHGs, but also partly because there is some, even though it's synthetic fuel being burnt, they are releasing some CO2 to the atmosphere. This is kind of one snapshot of 2050 where we should be siting the different generators. I'm really only showing this to illustrate how much work we have to do to build out this system. And I caveat it once more with, this is a system that has a lot of novel technologies. So if we don't have these novel technologies, we need to build a lot more than we're showing here. Obviously, it's a little bit exaggerated because these dots aren't fully representative of the size of the actual siting, but it gives you an idea of the general locations. We see a lot more in the Central Plains. We see a lot more on the coast as well. We don't see a lot of offshore wind, which is primarily because we have this novel technology build out happening, but we have huge amounts of resource to build in the coming decades. I just want to go into a little bit of the production cost dispatch of the system quickly, which is, we're showing the annual here day by day to give an idea of what resources are contributing when. Above the axis is generation or curtailment, below the axis is charging, storage, or losses of transmitting / losses for charging the storage. And what you'll notice is there's things like CCS popping up, which is the brown color, to provide reliability on cold periods and the summer peaks. But the wind and solar is like almost constantly around 50% of the generation. If we kind of break this up into like a higher resolution look at an hourly plot, if I draw your attention to the winter at the beginning of the year, the model is having a really hard time keeping reliability. The model, by definition, must have 100% reliability. And so it's using everything at its disposal to meet those demands. And so it's periods like that that can make the cost become pretty high when you are limiting the options that it has available. For the rest of the year, it does pretty well without too many hiccups, but that is where the primary issues occur, which is what we expected. And then if we look at a really zoomed in period of the highest strain period, we call it, which is a combination of how much of the grid is being utilized, how much of the thermal assets and storage are being utilized, and then the duration. So it's a combination of those factors because they both matter. And what you'll see here in this period, you'll see a lot of storage charging during the day, but we also see a lot of down dispatching of demand. So we have DSM down dispatching and then redispatching later on around these really difficult periods to try and correlate a bit better with the wind and solar as it comes through. And so we are also then dispatching the hydrogen and other novel fuel technologies to try and make it easier for the system to work through these periods. And one of the nice things of being able to model the high temporal frequency and granularity with the long term is it lets us kind of see where these really difficult periods are and other either assumptions or other things we can do to alleviate those problems. So we try and give it as many options as we can, but even here, it's finding it quite difficult to keep everything stable and keeping the voltage and frequency in line. These are just slides kind of showing the dispatch of the different generators. We do this because we're trying to understand how they're making their money in the model. How are they being compensated by the grid? Are they keeping within physical limits? Partly to double check that our modeling is correct, but also to see how would these operate? How would we understand how to incentivize them if the markets were to change? What would we need to do to make it a viable thing? And so this is kind of the thermal, or hydro is not thermal, but these are kind of the thermal generators, dispatchable generators, if you will. And so these, most of them don't have too much noise, but then we have some peaking resources. We have some, like this is the small modular reactor in the center middle, at the middle bottom plot. And they're sort of shaping around the renewables over time. And then we have peaking resources as well, and then we have the legacy plants as well. And then this is where we see this is where the volatility comes in from the renewables. This looks a lot more noisy. This is what's coming together. These smooth out when you add them together, but these are obviously sited geographically. And so we need to see how they come together, what transmission we need to put in, what do we need to reinforce to have that to work. And then we can also look at the curtailment. So it's quite scary to see at some periods we're getting 350 gigawatts of curtailment of generation, even though over the whole year it's only just over 1%. There are short periods where we see a lot, and that again is to do with the variability of the weather, but also it just sheds it. It's not going to build all the transmission to move 350 gigawatts for a small period of time. It's just way more economic just to shed that and not use it. We also try and track the storage. This is important for thinking about how that impacts the demand when we think about capacity of storage and how it interacts. On the left, we've got the what we kind of think of as the diurnal storage, like the lithium ion. On the right, we've got the hydrogen, which is the longer term storage. And you can, on the left, we've done it kind of by system strain. And the reason we do that is that we've inferred and kind of recognized that the sort of diurnal storage doesn't charge over a certain percent, typically 40% of system strain. And then below that, it kind of does arbitrage. And so there's two use factors of these that we see in the model. For the hydrogen, it's very different. It's just really sitting there, absorbing really cheap electricity when it can, producing the fuel, and then it's selling it into the market at a later date when it's needed, when the higher system strain occurs. And so you see that in the sort of how much is being stored in the energy storage. On the left is the lithium ion type storage, much more noisy, much more volatile. And then you have the seasonal storage of the hydrogen, which basically stores up until summer and then sells in the second half of the season. So it's really trying to balance those two, produce the other products as well at the same time. You still need transmission. You still need to build out the grid, even though this isn't a super grid situation. Even without thinking about a macro grid, which is, we agree, is really important and does help these situations. Even without that, we need to invest heavily in transmission because we're just going to need to move power around a lot more. Partly because we're doubling or tripling the demand, so that necessitates more movement of power, but also because where we currently have generation assets are not going to be where we build them in the future. It's just not going to be the same places if we want to do it in a cost optimal fashion, which is a big caveat, but I think it makes sense. And then finally, we want to show kind of the hydrogen economy, which sort of powers a lot of the other products and fuels. We're looking at roughly 658 terawatt hours, so just less than 2/3 of 1,000, which gives us, you can kind of think of that as another battery storage, a long-term storage that basically can either be an anti-generator or can provide fuel to power, clean up some of the natural gas, pipe it into the pipelines to some percentage, or used for downstream products like ammonia, which we find around 6% of the natural gas in the US is used to make ammonia. And so the model is using that instead of that natural gas to reduce emissions in a way that can use cheap electrons quite easily. This is the final slide, trying to kind of see the things that we would do as the first steps, regardless of after 2035, because after 2035, we feel that you need new technologies to help. What level we need that is difficult to define early on, but we certainly need to think about it and possibly even plan for that happening. My only reason for saying that is we can't fail this this task. This isn't a task that we can fail morally. I don't think we need to be able to succeed, and so not letting the perfect get in the way of the good just doesn't cut it anymore for us. And so huge amounts of factories for wind and solar. The supply chain for solar is 5-fold increased. Wind production is around 500 factories. We need huge amounts of gigafactory type battery plants, 13 of them by 2035. The nuclear industry needs to come back. We need lots of manufacturing for natural gas, synthetic natural gas, particularly to basically wean us off our addiction of the fossil fuels. And then we need transmission infrastructure, even without a macrogrid, at a level that's double China has ever achieved. And I use China as an example because they have a large number, and so it's a nice round doubling. And modernizing the distribution grid. The electric markets will need to be basically reinvented. I don't think there's going to be like a gradual shift that's going to happen. They're just going to be fundamentally different. And that's another discussion for a whole nother panel. The hydrogen economy needs to be unlocked, in our opinion, even if it's a niche of 5%, 10% is still a huge amount of flexibility. And then we need rules coming in straight away. All vehicles need to be electric. All buildings need to have heat pumps and water heaters that are the heat pumps as well, because we need to turn this stock over as quickly as possible. And then we need to have some industrial CCS or some other products. And the one thing that's not on this list is direct air capture. We have seen in our modeling that we could, there's no current market for carbon dioxide, but we could, because the social cost of carbon is actually higher at the moment than we're seeing in the model for direct air capture to be deployed, we could just pay for carbon to be captured and put underground, which will be lower than the social cost of carbon. And that will hopefully unlock a market for the carbon products to create synthetic natural gas or synthetic fuels for shipping and aviation, so that we don't have to turn over those very high capital cost infrastructures so rapidly, seems we're going to have to reinvent the whole system anyway. So that's my last slide. I'll stop there and allow questions, and that's it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Clack. That it all seems pretty straightforward, doesn't it? We definitely need a lot of talented people coming in here, so we all have our work cut out for us. Let's start with a lot of questions here, actually. First of all, you mentioned transmission as a source of flexibility. Can you explain a little bit more about why you view transmission as a flex source? Sure.
Yeah, I see it as a flex source because if you can buy power from far enough away, it'll be anti-correlated to your generation locally, and so you can essentially. I think of the atmosphere as being a battery, basically, because it is, and it moves around. And so we're just tapping into that. And so we need to be able to use transmission as our spatial storage, essentially, which is why I think of it as flexibility.
Okay. I was struck by the novel technologies that you are depending on here. I mean, what's your real view on the viability of that? And is that really critical that we come up with like the next generation of nuclear and things like that, as well as the hydrogen economy? I guess you're really assuming that hydrogen is going to be very cost effective and be very mainstream, right?
Well, so we're putting in costs from literature and from vendors. I can't really judge on how truthful they are or going to be. But we've done sort of MAC analysis where we've taken them away, and the opportunity cost is pretty high. And so although we're relying on this, we kind of allow everything to compete, and then we have other scenarios where we take them out and see what the additional cost is. We can kind of back calculate, how much more we could spend on those resources before they're not useful. And what we find is around a doubling of cost if we don't have those resources. And of course, there's lots of caveats. We're using cost curves and so on and so forth. So, it could be less than that, it could be more than that. But the idea behind it is that there's some chinks in different technologies that we can't overcome because it's just a physical limit. And so we need other things. And other things might not be what we've suggested, but it is just alluding to the fact that something else will probably need to come in at some point to help. The cheapest for this is the hydrogen and nuclear.
Okay. And you showed a couple of scenarios. So I believe it was on the order of 400 billion a year with your preferred mix, and then a variable renewable only was the trillion per year. I mean, would some of the risk here fall within those ranges, you think,
Yes,
if some of these technologies don't happen? Okay.
Yeah. So the $1 trillion is basically if we don't have any new technology. So we do, and that's a lie. We do have some hydrogen, but it's expensive. But we don't have any novel generation technologies. And so, so what I kind of think of that as our backup. If nothing else comes along, we can do it. It's just going to be a bit more expensive. Well, not a bit more, a lot more expensive. And that would just mean that we have to drive down the cost somehow, some other way, which people are good at doing. But that's what we'd have to do. That's what we'd have to focus on, is driving the cost down about 60% compared to
pretty good motivation for innovators out there and inventors to do something, right? So
yeah, exactly.
I didn't see that very clearly anyway, that offshore wind and geothermal, how do those figure in your future?
So the offshore wind, when we have the novel technologies, you get around 30 gigawatts by 2050. If you don't have the novel technologies, you get around 200 gigawatts for offshore wind, just because it's a higher capacity factor resource, a bit anti-correlated. For enhanced geothermal, you get around about 4 or 5 gigawatts in the high VRE case, and then for the novel technologies, it's competing against MSR, and so everywhere where you see MSR, you could just replace it with EGS. It's just with the cost projections we have, the EGS loses out to the MSR technology, but in terms of the modeling, they kind of are interchangeable in terms of how they provide a power.
Okay, so what shows up in the novel technologies is dependent on the cost curves that you're projecting for that going forward. Okay.
Yep.
There's a lot of interest in the questions about this 175-year data set, how you generated that. I mean, what weather data drives that, and how, what are your projections with climate change type issues as part of that?
Yeah, so the 175-year data set is something we've been working on for a few years. The base case data is from NOAA, reanalysis data sets. I think it's from PSL, I think it's called now. It used to be PSD back when I was there, where they've done a lot of really great work over the US, but we're taking that data and we're rerunning it and reanalyzing it to give us higher temporal and geographic resolution, but then also producing power and load data sets from it, so we can really see the driving changes that are coming through it. And we're trying to do a lot of, the reason I say preliminary is doing a lot of analysis of how much of it is model, startup, and I don't want to get into boring details, but there can be stuff that's driven by the model that we're trying to weed out as well at the same time. So that's primarily where it's from. And then we use CMIP data for the future projections, CMIP 5 and 6 primarily, to look at how that then drives our historical data and forces changes in the system.
Interesting. Yeah, it'd be a great data set. You pointed out kind of a shift toward peak appearing in the winter, and I suppose this is a good opportunity as any to take on the elephant in the room, which is what's your view about the ERCOT-like situation we saw a couple weeks ago, and how well can that be reflected in this modeling and these long-term data sets? What's your thinking there?
Yeah, so we in the climate data we saw in February there was going to be a massive cool down over Texas. We're not saying we did the modeling, but it was kind of in the climate data. It's also in the historical data. The 175-year data set had about 20 of these events that were actually worse than the event we saw in Texas. But again,
really? It's
preliminary, of course, because it's not finalized in terms of the accuracy of that. But we also saw that a lot more wind power could have been generated if winterization had happened better. It still would have got to the levels that it got to from our data, and we actually have some slides at the end of the presentation when we upload it that goes into that a little bit for people to kind of look at as kind of a little extra nugget for them if they take the time to go through the slides.
Okay, great. Yeah, and the slides will be posted along with the recording of this webinar for everybody. We talked about the bracket of the cost assumptions, this 400 billion to trillion a year. How does that compare with just today's cost, the status quo kind of thing?
Yeah, the estimate we have for 2020 is around 350 billion is the annual cost of electricity. When we look at energy, it's roughly around 800 billion for all energy. But of course, that changes quite dramatically year on year. But so the sort of the electrified scenario with these novel fuels is about 450, and so we're actually seeing a net reduction of around 40% in energy burden. And then the other scenario, which is the full VRE, is around a 20 to 30% increase in the energy burden. So, you know, it's not like it's, in my opinion, it's not earth-shattering, but it makes it more difficult to electrify other sectors if you are raising the cost of the fuel that you're trying to sell to these people as they're trying to electrify.
Right. Okay. Yeah, it all has to fit together here. You mentioned, you know, electrification, and how does efficiency, you know, building redesigns, you know, more of the megawatt side of stuff figure in here? Do you see a lot of that playing in here? Is that part of your modeling?
Yeah, so we do. So we do a lot of work on the Q rating of the building stock and things like that to kind of look at what we could spend money on to make it efficient, and we build in assumptions about how much we're doing that, and we basically push that to the max that we can over time, because we just assume that if you're gonna be trying to get to a clean grid, the best way to do that is to use as minimal amount of energy as you can, and so we sort of push them to the max in our economy-wide modeling. So we do that for buildings, we do that for vehicles as we push the efficiency up as well.
So we have to do well on pretty much everything we're talking about here, really, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, and the DSM, we do have demand response, and so the customers can bid in through a DSO and bid the demand as well. That's all modeled as well. So we're giving it as much in this scenario. This is our optimistic scenario where we give it everything we can to make it as cheap as possible.
Okay. You mentioned that you weren't making assumptions about changes in market design, other than kind of saying you think we have to reinvent it, right?
Yeah.
Maybe you want to elaborate more about what you have any concepts of changes you think are necessary in market design, and you know, would that affect your modeling output or not?
Well, we can go another hour or three. No, so the model is trying to minimize system costs, and then it's trying to compensate resources through the market designs that we have today, and then the model kind of adjusts the markets to make it compensate correctly. And so one of the markets, PJM, goes to a carbon-based pricing. There's a floor price that wind and solar get and nuclear get. If they show up, they just get paid like $1 per megawatt, basically. And then the market basically splits into two. There's the marginal part, which stays the same, but then there's the sort of subscription part that happens first, or I don't want to call it capacity, but that happens first. And then when they're available, they get compensated for that. And then the variable generators get compensated on a second tier market from that. But it kind of depends on the region. We haven't come up with a great way yet, but one nice thing is from the outputs, we can keep iterating the different market designs on the solution and see how good it does, how efficient it is, how much rent seeking happens, things like that, and sort of iterate it. But the main core principle in the model is to minimize system costs. Right. And so it's thinking about that overarching concept of it has to reach this, so there's always a shadow price in the background.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Chris. This is wonderful. We have dozens of additional questions here. We'll send those to you. We'll see if we can maybe write up a little summary addressing some of the ones we had, no chance of getting to today, because literally there are dozens there. Let me just encourage everybody to register. First of all, everybody who did register for this session is here. We'll get an email when the slides and recording of the session are posted online. Ryan will get that up soon. The ESIG Spring Technical Workshop continues at the same time on Tuesdays and Thursdays for the coming 6 weeks, but it's important to register for each session because there is a separate WebEx link for each of those, and you can get it on your calendar if you register, and Ryan has provided the link for that. The next session coming up right away this Thursday is the opening plenary on electricity pricing. I hope you'll join us for as many of the sessions as you can. They are all free, and please spread the word to get everybody on here. It's great to pull people in. Anybody can get on the newsletter, whether you're a member or not. You know, just contact info@esig.energy and get involved here. So I thank you for participating today. You know, and please be safe. Thank you, everybody. Join us some more for the upcoming sessions.